It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, this is the Happy Families Podcast. My name's Dr. Justin Coulson. So good to have you along. Today on the podcast, an interview with a difference. I've been trying to get hold of Abigail Shrier. She's the author of a book that I found compelling a few years ago called Irreversible Damage. It was a controversial and provocative book. Some people really got mad at me because I read it and said that it was quite useful. But she's got a brand new book out. Once again, highly provocative. It seems that she likes to take on topics that are going to be challenging. The book is called Bad Therapy: Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. This is a book that's all about emotions. It's a book that's all about what's going on with our kids and why there are so many challenges. Now, I've reached out to Abigail Shrier a couple of times to try and get her on the podcast. She's been a little bit busy on a whole lot of other podcasts like Joe Rogan and the ones where there are like 2 million people that listen to every episode. Now, we're doing okay on this podcast, but we're not quite at that level. So being a little parenting podcast in Australia, we're not quite at the Abigail Shrier level at this point, it seems, although we will keep on trying. In the meantime, though, because it's such an important conversation, because it's so provocative and there are so many things that we can pull out of it, what I'm going to do is share a couple of snippets from a discussion that Abigail Shrier had with Barry Weiss of the Honestly podcast. Honestly with Barry Weiss is the name of that podcast. The first thing that I want to share with you was how we got to be where we are. That is, why are so many kids struggling with their mental health, and why is therapy so popular among our young generation?
I'm the tail end of Gen X. I was born in 1978. And when I was in high school, America reached the high water mark of divorce. Our families were being broken up at rates that America hadn't seen. And a lot of people my age grew into adulthood and they really felt like emotionally they were under-supported by their childhoods and by their parents. And my generation was a big believer in therapy. We went into therapy in greater numbers than any prior generation. We loved the movie Good Will Hunting, and we thought therapy is how you get better. It's how you make yourself strong and get the girl. And we went into therapy. We started exploring our own childhoods. The best parenting books were written by therapists, and we read them all. And we convinced ourselves that we could become the most emotionally supportive parents. We were going to be there for our kids. We were going to understand them. We were going to be close to our kids. And most important of all, we were going to shield our kids from trauma, any emotional pain, because that's what we learned. Trauma can come from any source. It can come from a bad grade. It can come from a friend dropping you. And we were going to save our children from ever experiencing this trauma. We had this idea that if we just watched enough, if we just poured more hours into our children, we poured more than anyone else, we could save them from ever having emotional pain.
Now, I'm reading the book at the moment. I'll be discussing it more on the Happy Families Book Club podcast coming up in a couple of weeks. But there are some really interesting ideas here. First of all, Australia has generally followed this United States trend. We're a very different nation, and we haven't quite gone exactly the same way as the US. But the general things that Shrier is talking about in this conversation are pretty consistent with what has happened in Australia, especially over the last few years as the word trauma has become commonplace and really part of educational and parenting parlance. To give you an idea of how things have changed, around about 10 years ago, I wrote a book called 9 Ways to a Resilient Child. At the time, nobody was talking about trauma, and I pretty much didn't write about trauma at all in the book. The world has changed that much. Now, the second thing that I want to play to you from the Honestly podcast with Barry Weiss is where Shrier starts to talk about how trauma and specifically how therapy may be exacerbating the very problems we're trying to stop in our young people.
The number one symptom of depression is rumination or dwelling on past pain, rehearsing bad memories, in a loop. At the very least, if nothing else, we have more rumination than we've ever seen before. So it may be that kids are more open about their mental health struggles and it is less stigmatized, but they are also engaging in the behavior that is the number one symptom of depression. That is rehearsing and telling surveys about all their bad thoughts and feelings. So that's an indication in and of itself that the rates of depression have gone up. But we're not just seeing depression. We're hearing about summer anxiety, Relocation anxiety.
Sorry,
What is summer?
What's summer anxiety?
That's an anxiety a child might find over the summer when they can't play with their friends. Relocation anxiety, when your parents move to a new place. Social phobia, when you have trouble making friends. They have so dialed down mental disorder that you'll see that it applies to basically the entire experience of the human condition. And we have a very diagnosed group of young people who are convinced that they have these mental health disorders because we apply them over everything that used to be just considered heartbreak. No, that's depression. Worry. No, that's anxiety. Shyness. No, that's social anxiety.
So this is fascinating to me and something that I tend to agree with, but I also struggle with. So there is value in having labels where somebody is genuinely experiencing psychological challenge. However, a label is something that some people will live into. And once they have that label, it's something that becomes, I guess, almost a crutch or an excuse. Now, please, if you have a label, I'm not saying that that's what will happen. It's a risk in some cases. And increasingly, as I work in schools and I work with families and I talk to people who are struggling and I engage with psychologists and mental health support workers and whoever else, what I'm seeing more and more is that we seem to be looking for increasing levels of labeling to explain what's going on. There are challenges with that, and we need to be mindful of it. Again, the book's really provocative around this. I think that she sometimes takes positions that are far more extreme than are necessary, but the conversation is fascinating. Abigail Shrier is the author of Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. In fact, she describes that a lot of kids don't want to grow up. And right in her sights as this book is progressing, Shrier is really taking to task those who work in therapeutic environments, particularly those who work in what's known as a psychodynamic environment, people who are doing psychotherapy. Now, that is different to something like cognitive behavioral therapy, and Australia is very much oriented towards CBT. There are some psychotherapeutic approaches in Australia that are gaining popularity, but it's mainly a CBT environment, which is quite different to the US. From that point of view, Australia is doing a whole lot better than what Shrier makes out. Nevertheless, she introduces a word that I hadn't heard of before. The word is iatrogenics. Have a listen to what she has to say about this as it relates to therapy.
I want to introduce a word. It's iatrogenesis. And iatrogenesis is a Greek word meaning when the healer introduces harm. And what I want people to know is that any intervention, no matter how good, from Tylenol to X-rays, can carry risk. They all come with some degree of risk. Now, when we need them, when you need the Tylenol, it's worth the risk. And when you don't need the intervention, when you don't need the medication, you don't stand to benefit. Therefore, you're only exposed to the risk. So go to the ER if you need it, absolutely. But of course, the ER is filled with things like MRSA and other bacteria you may pick up while you're there. So don't go if you don't need it. The same is true with X-rays. Of course, we know we don't need the extra radiation. But what people may not know is that psychotherapy also comes with iatrogenic harms, and that researchers have looked into this, and they have found a lot of harms that therapy can and does cause in some percentage of the population, like increasing anxiety, like increasing depression, like making PTSD worse, like robbing a patient of a feeling of efficacy that they can do anything to improve their own life, like demoralization, feeling that they are limited by this new diagnosis they just got. And alienation from family members is another one that can come out of therapy. These are all risks that are worth it, of course, if you really need the therapy. But if you don't need the therapy, all you're exposing a child to is the risk.
And one of the main things that Shrier talks about in the book is that we are exposing our children to a whole lot of therapy, which means that we potentially are exposing them to a whole lot of risk. Abigail Shrier is the author of Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up, and she spoke with Barry Weiss on the Honestly podcast. Here she explains bad therapy and who suffers the most when it comes to this iatrogenesis.
What I call bad therapy, that is iatrogenic therapy, on the entire generation. They are swimming in it. Now, in terms of boys and girls, there's no question teen girls are suffering the most. In terms of mental health, they had the highest rates of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, suicidal harm. And one of the interesting things about these girls is when I interviewed their families, when I interviewed them, nearly all of them had a therapist. And here's the thing that surprised me. It seems like the most helpful and innocuous thing in the world. Ask a kid regularly, how are you feeling? Well, what's the harm in that, right? You're checking in with your child. You're checking in with, your student. But it turns out, and there's a lot of good research behind this, a lot of it conducted by Iris Mouse out of Berkeley, that constantly focusing on your feelings and taking your emotional temperature and thinking your feelings are an important signal, that enough is alone to make you much less happy. And parents no longer trust their own judgment, even with their own children. They believe they have to rely on a mental health professional. And that little bit of self-doubt, that sense that I can't decide what's bad for my kid or good for my child, because of course I'm not a neurobiologist or a neuropsychologist. That self-doubt has unfortunately allowed parents to step aside and allowed all kinds of interlopers to come between parent and child. And in this case, I argue in the book that the number one interloper that we've all sort of ceded our authority to really is the mental health professional. And they're having their way with our kids. And it's really, really making the mental health of a generation much worse.
Oh, you can see how provocative this is and maybe why I'm loving the book so much. Some very easy to agree with, some very challenging to accept. In her sights, as well as those who practice psychotherapy, are the school counsellors, those who are working in an adjunct role, in a role that's not actually a mental health care role, people who are not trained to be doing this work, but who step into that anyway. There's a lot of heavy lifting done around the problem with restorative practice and restorative circles in schools, which is something that I've argued is not done well most of the time in most schools. It's a really big challenge. And then gentle parenting comes in for a bit of firing.
This was the ultimate in therapeutic parenting. Remember, a therapist doesn't judge and they don't put themselves above you. They simply meet you where you are and try to understand your pain. And they give you choices. And that is the way parents are to conduct themselves. They don't ever discipline. They try never to say no if they can avoid it. They certainly never punish. And they wouldn't even think of spanking. In fact, a timeout is too much for them. That's too much trauma. They instead give the child a series of choices. Would you prefer the red cup or the blue cup? Oh no, you spilled your Cheerios on the floor. You just threw the cup at me. What should we do about that? And it's this series of questions and always meeting the child at his or her level. And I can only tell you that the parenting blogs of parents who try this are hilarious, because it turns out being the gentle parent doesn't necessarily mean you raise the gentle child. Oh gosh, it's horrible to punish your child. Punishing a child is the hardest thing parents ever have to do. It is time consuming. It makes you feel lame. You feel like Principal Rooney. It's horrible. And you make your kid really mad at you. And you know what? You love your kid and you love your relationship with your kid. Punishing your kids is the single hardest thing you ever have to do. It's awful. And so the idea that you could raise gentle children, wonderful children who are thoughtful into adulthood without ever making them feel bad is such an attractive notion. If it worked, I would be 1,000% behind it. Because let me tell you something, when I have to send a kid to his room in the middle of dinner, it wrecks my whole dinner. It's awful. And then you have to, you worry about, did they get enough to eat? And, how long are they going to be mad at me? Because they're going to be mad at me. And it's an awful thing to do. And the idea that we can short circuit it, that we can raise good adults without ever being the authoritative parent, gosh, that's attractive.
So this is the most frustrating part of the book. Clearly, Abigail Shrier is not a parenting expert and hasn't done a PhD in psychology. And as much as she might have some good ideas and some really provocative ideas, I love the challenge of this book because there are so many things that are almost right and there are so many things that are dead on, but there are also a handful of things that Abigail Shrier just gets completely wrong. This was one of the worst chapters that I read in the entire book. I wish that she had read my book. I'm not huge on gentle parenting. I've been really clear about that. But what I am big on is that if we can understand our children's basic psychological needs and create the right environment, we're going to get much, much better results. All right. So the last thing that she said that I wanted to share with you is Abigail Shrier, the author of Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up, in her conversation with Barry Weiss on the Honestly podcast. The last thing I want to share with you is her final advice.
The thing I want parents to think about is that kids have too much of everything right now. They're being hit by too much tech, too much surveillance, too much therapy, too much adult oversight, not enough time alone, not enough time with quiet, not enough time with other friends. Parents need to subtract themselves and subtract the tech too. They need to raise kids with authority so that they tell the kids, here are the rules, right and wrong. Now use your judgment. And they need to be able to have confidence, or take the risk that their kids will do just fine on their own and have that confidence. But there's something else too. When a child runs into a problem, when they start suffering in some manner, and the parent considers letting them off easy or asking for an accommodation in school, here's what I want parents to ask themselves. Will this make my child stronger? If the answer is yes, you're helping your child a lot. If the answer is no, don't do it.
Now, this book is a fascinating read. It's Abigail Shrier, the author of Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. And those snippets were from the Honestly podcast with Barry Weiss. You know what? The book slams therapists. The book slams trauma. The book slams asking questions like, how are you feeling? And getting kids focused on their emotions. And there's a lot to hate about that. And there's also a lot to like about it. In essence, I'm feeling like there's going to be more major disappointment in this book than brilliance, but so many thoughtful provocations, and I'm really enjoying it. Can't wait to give you my book review in just a couple of weeks on the Happy Families podcast when we dive into everything Kylie and I have been reading. For now, though, that is it for today. Tomorrow it's Anzac Day, so we won't be around. We'll be back on Friday with I'll Do Better Tomorrow. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer, and for more information about making your family happier, we'd love for you to visit us at happyfamilies.com.au and check out my book, The Parenting Revolution.